Okay guys, so welcome back again. So in this video we'll learn how to make custom hooks by making 3 custom hooks. Firstly, we'll be making a useCounter hook that will give you a basic understanding how to make custom hooks. Then secondly, we'll be making a useToggle hook that can be useful for you if you want to display a navbar or you want to hide a navbar. Then you can use that hook that is called the useToggle hook, or otherwise you can use that hook that is the useToggle hook also for displaying modals inside your application. And lastly, we'll be making a useApi hook to get data from an external API. So without wasting any time, let's dive into our code and let's see that what we have. So currently, as we see that here, I've created a very basic React application by simply using the create React app package. And here inside the source folder, I've created this folder that is called the hooks folder, in which we'll create our own custom hooks. So if we have a look at the app.js file here, what I've done is that I've implemented a very simple counter. I've created this state variable that is called the count variable with the initial state of 0. And then we have a function here to increment the count by 1. And then we have a function here to decrement the count by 1. And then inside the JSX, inside the h4, we are simply displaying the value of the count variable, that is the stateful variable. And then we have 2 buttons here to increment the count and decrement the count. And they have these events, that is the onClick event to increment the count and decrement the count. So if we have a look on the right side, we see that if we click on this thing here, we are able to increment the count. And if we click here, we are able to decrement the count. But what if you want to have a counter in many of your components, then you need to write this much of code in each and every component. So for that, what we can do, we can create our own custom hook. So let's go inside the hooks folder and we'll create a new file here. So let's create a new file here called useCounter.js. And this is the first fundamental of creating your own hooks. That is each hook should start with the use keyword. So therefore, I'm calling it useCounter.js. And now from inside this file, what I want to do, I simply want to export a function called useCounter. So let me simply export a function here, useCounter, simply like this. And now this function should return something, and that return something should be filled in a moment. So now firstly, what we want to have inside this useCounter function or this useCounter hook is that we want to have a state of the count variable. So we can use useState from React. So we can do it like this, that is import from React. And what we need to have here, we need to have useState. So we can use useState inside our own hook. So this is the second fundamentals of creating your own hooks. That is, you can use React hooks inside your own hooks, but they should be at the top level. That is like this. That is, you can call it on the top level of your hooks. So we can say const count, comma set count equal to use state, and the initial state would be 0. Or instead of passing here 0, what we can do, we can pass in the initial state in the useCounter hook to make it more generic, so that the count should not always start with 0. If something is passed, then the initial state should be that something. So we can pass in the initial state here as well. And the default value, we can keep it to be 0. That is, if no initial state is passed, then the initial state would be 0. So instead of 0 here, we can simply pass in the initial state like this. And then we want to have 2 functions, that is to increment the count. So increment count like this. And then what we can do, we can simply say set count to be the current count plus 1. That is what we are doing. But again, here what we can do, we can pass in an optional value here, that is to increment the count by some number, or if no value is passed, then we can simply pass in 1 here, that is to increment the count by 1. So here what we can do, we can simply do val here. And now similarly, we want to have a decrement count method here as well, or the function as well. So we can simply say decrement count, simply like this. And we again have an optional value here, that is, if some value is passed, then the counter would be decreased by that value, or otherwise it would be decreased by 1. So here what we can do, we can simply say count minus val like this. And now here inside this return thing, what we want to return? We want to return the count itself, that is the current count. Then we want to return these 2 functions, that is the increment count and the decrement count function. Simply like this. So now let's save this. And now we have this useCounter hook ready to be used inside our app.js or any of your components. So let's go to our app.js and let me comment this thing out from here. And now we are getting these errors here and we'll be fixing them in a moment. So what we have here, we can say const something equal to useCounter. That is the hook we created. And this useCounter has been automatically imported from this file here. That is from this file here. And now since we are not passing it the initial value here, so the default value or the initial value would be 0. And here what we get in return? We get in return these three things, that is the count, increment count and decrement count. So we can say count comma increment count and decrement count, simply like this. And now the errors are gone. And now instead of handling the on-click events like this, since we are passing in an optional value here, so what we need to do, need to do it like this, that is an arrow functions equal to increment count by the default value, that is 1, and then we can again pass in the second function here, that is decrement count, and with the default value of 0. So it is giving me some error and the error is gone now. So now let's save this. And now we see that the initial state is 0 as soon as we saved, the application reloaded. So if we click on increment count, we are able to increment the count. If we decrement the count, we are able to decrement the count. So why not? Let's pass in the initial value of 26 here. And now what we want to do, and let me save this thing. And the application should reload. So let me hard reload it. So the initial value starts from 26. And inside this increment count, we want to increment it by 7. And we want to decrement it by 2. So let's save this, let's reload the page, and if we click here increment count, we are able to increment the value by 7, simply like this. And if you want to decrement, we can decrement it like this. So this is a very generic hook, that is the useCounter hook. If you want, you can use it inside your application, and it gives you a basic understanding how to create your own hook. So there are two rules. Firstly, the hook should start with the keyword use, and secondly, you can use React hooks inside your own hooks, but only at the top level, as we can see here. So now let's create your own useToggle hook. So for that, let's again go to our app.js file, and let me simply comment this thing out from here. And now here what I'll do, I'll simply paste in something that is the default way of doing toggling inside your React application. So let me copy something and let me paste it here. So if we save this, and if we reload the page, we have this thing here. So first let's see that what is happening here. Everything inside this app component is commented out, but only this thing is uncommented. So here we have a stateful variable that is open, and the initial value is false. And then we have a function toggle here, which simply inverts the value of this is open by using setIsOpen thing here. And then we have the function called onOpen, which simply sets the value of isOpen to true always. And then we have this function onClose, which always sets the value of isOpen to false. So now here inside the h3, we see that we are simply displaying the value of isOpen. So currently it is false. So that is what it is displayed here. And then we have three buttons here. That is to toggle the value, to open the value, that is to make it always true. And then we have this close button, which makes the value to always false. And now here we are displaying the component conditionally, that is depending on the value of isOpen. If the value isOpen is true, then we are displaying this div here, that is simply mimics our navbar or a model here. So now let's simply click on open here. We see the value changes to true, and we can see our navbar. And if we click on close, we are able to hide the navbar. And if we click on close multiple times, nothing would happen because the value is false always. And if we click on open always, the value remains to be true. But if we click on this toggle, we are able to invert the value of isOpen. So now in any of your component in which you want to have this kind of functionality, that is the toggle functionality, you need to write this much of code. So what we can do, we can extract this functionality out of this component, and we can make our own custom hook that is called the useToggle hook. So let's create a new file called useToggle.js. And here what we need to have, we need to import something from React, and that is the state itself. So use a state like this, and then we need to export a function here. So export function useToggle like this, and then we can write our own stuff inside this useToggle function. And then we want to return something also, so we can return something here. And now inside this function, firstly we want to have a stateful variable that is called the isOpen variable. So we can use state here like this, and the variable's name is isOpen, whether the value is true or false. And here we can simply pass in false to be the initial value. But again, what we can do, we can pass in the initial value inside this useToggle hook itself. So we can pass in an initial value here like this, or the default value would be false if in case no initial value is passed here. And here inside the use state, we can simply use in the initial value like this. And now here we want to have three functions, that is to toggle the value of isOpen, then to make it always open, and then to make it always close, that is to make it always false. So why not? Let's simply copy these functions from here. So let me copy these functions from here and let me simply paste it here. And now we have these three functions here, that is the toggle function, the onOpen function, and the onClose function. This toggles the value of isOpen. This always sets the value of isOpen to true. This always sets the value of isOpen to false. And now what we need to do? We need to simply return this isOpen state variable and these three functions from this hook here, that is called the useToggle hook. So what we can return here, we can simply return isOpen, then we can simply return toggle, then we can return onOpen, and then lastly we can return onClose. And now we can use this useToggle hook inside our app.js file. So why not? Let me simply comment this out from here, and here what I'll do, I'll simply say const something equal to useToggle, and this useToggle hook has been automatically imported from our file, that is from this file. And now here what it returns us isOpen, it returns us the toggle function, it returns us the onOpen function, and it returns us the onClose function. So if we save this, nothing would change here on the right side because everything remains the same here inside the JSX because I've kept the variable names to be same. So if we click on toggle, we are able to toggle the value of isOpen and we are able to see the navbar depending on the value of isOpen. And if we simply click on open always, the value remains true, so the navbar is always visible. And if we click on close, the value of the isOpen remains false and we are not able to see the navbar. So this is how easy it is to use the useToggle hook inside any of your components. So you can use this hook, that is useToggle, inside any of your components. So now let's see that how do we create our own API hook. So for that, first let's see that what is the traditional way of doing or making an API call inside your React application. So firstly, let me simply comment this out from here and let me simply copy something from here, that is from my clipboard, and let me paste it here. So now everything is commented out inside this app.js file or this app component. And if we scroll down, we have these three stateful variables here, that is the data variable to contain the actual data from the API. Then we have the error stateful variable, that is if there is an error calling the API. And then we have the loading stateful variable that simply represents whether the API call is in progress or not. After that, we have this useEffect function that gets called when the component mounts because we are passing in an empty array as a dependency here. And then we are making an API call here by using the axios library to this URL that is simply returns us a list of users. And then inside the then block, we are getting the response here and we are setting the data from response.data. It should be response.data and not data because in axios, response.data contains the actual data. So if we get a response, we are simply setting the data from response.data and then we are setting the error to be null because there is no error. And if there is an error inside the catch block, we are setting the error message to be the error.message and then we are setting the data to be null. And finally, what we are doing, we are simply setting the loading state to be false. So that's what is happening here. And if we have a look at the JSX here, we are simply displaying loading depending on whether this loading is true or false because it is a boolean here. So the initial state would be true. So initially it would be in loading state and then we are displaying the error if there is an error. And then we are displaying the data in the pre-tags using json.stringify. So now let me save this thing from here. And if we reload the page, we see that we get a loading state here and then we are getting a JSON data here. So it is all centered. So let me simply give it a style here. So style equal to text line to be start. So we see that we are getting JSON object here that contains our users here. So this response is coming from the API. So now in each and every component in which you want to call an API, you need to do these things here. And then you can render the component depending on these three variables, that is whether the API call is in progress, whether we have an error or we have a data here. So we need to do this thing always. So why not? Let's simplify this and let's make our own useApi hook. So for that, what I'm going to do, I'm going to create a new hook inside my hooks folder that is called useApi.js. And here we need to import two things from React, that is the useState and useEffect, because we see that we are using useEffect here and we are using useState here. So inside the useApi, what we need to do, we need to import use state and use effect from React like this, and then we can create our hook here, that is export function, and the name of the function would be useApi, and here we need to return something, and what we need to return we'll fill in that in a moment, and call this function or this hook. What we need is a URL to be called. So what we can do, we can simply pass in the URL, and then what we need to have, three stateful variables that are like these, that is the data, the error, and loading. So why not, let's simply copy this thing from here and let me paste it here. And now we have these three stateful variables inside our own hook. And as you know that we can use React hooks inside the top level of our own hooks. So we are doing that, and we are simply doing it like this. And then we also need to call this URL, that is this API. So what we can do, we can use the use effect hook here, that is use effect like this. And then in the cleaner function, we do not want to do anything. And then the dependency of this use effect would be URL, because we want to make this hook run as soon as this URL changes. And the effect would be this effect, that is we want to make a call using the axios library. So let me simply copy it from here, and let me paste it here inside the use effect. And now this is giving us an error because we need to import axios from axios. So we can say import axios from axios like this, and now the error is gone, and we need to return something. So what do we need to return? We need to return whether it is loading, so we can return the loading state, and then we can return error if there is an error, and finally we can return data if there is data. So let's simply save this. And lastly, we need to make one change, that is here we need to change this URL, that is the hard-coded URL, to the URL that is passed here inside this hook. So we can save this thing from here. And now let's go back to our app.js file. And here what we need to do, we can simply comment all this stuff out from here, and we can use our own API hook. And let me simply copy this URL from here. And now here what I can do it like this, that is called something equal to useApi like this. And here we can pass in the URL itself. And this useApi hook has been automatically imported from this file, that is the file we created. And now here what it returns us the loading state, it returns us the possible error, and it returns us the data finally like this. So if we save this and if we reload the page, we see that we get the data back from the URL, that is from the API. So now let's simply change this URL which doesn't exist. So let's save this. We see that we are getting this message here, that is request for failed with status code 404. That means the URL doesn't exist. And if we change the URL to some URL that does exist to get only the first user, we are getting back this response, that is this data here. And now you can do anything with this data that is coming here from this useApi hook. So this is how easy it is to create your own useApi hook, and you can use it inside any of your components. So let's do some fun stuff by combining the useApi hook and useCounter hook. So let's go to our app.js file, and here what I want to have, I can have my counter here, that is something equal to useCounter, and the initial value would be 0. Let me pass it 0 here, or let me simply pass in 1 here like this. And what it returns, it simply returns us the count thing here, and then the increment count, and then the decrement count thing here. And here what I want to do, let me take it to the top of this thing here. So what I want to do, I want to change this URL depending on this count variable here. So for that I want to have two buttons here. So let me simply have two buttons here that simply says increment user, because /1 gives us the first user, /2 gives us the second user. So here we have this button to increment the count variable here that starts with 1, and then we have one more button here that simply decrements the user, that is decrement user here. And then here inside this onClick event, what I want to do, I simply want to decrement the count here like this by 1. And then inside this onClick event, what I want to do, I simply want to increment the count by 1. So I can do it like this. So increment count like this. And now here inside the URL, I want to simply pass in a template string. So let me copy this thing from here up till here, and let me comment it out or let me remove it here, and let me pass in a template string. And here we can pass in the count variable. That is the value of the count here. So the initial count is 1 here. So if we save this, we see that we are getting this first user here. If we click on this button here, we see that we are getting the second user here because of this ID we can see. If we click here, we are getting the third user. If we decrement, we are getting back the second user. If we decrement once again, we are getting the first user. But if we decrement again, we see that we are getting 404 status because the counter's value is 0 and there is no user with that ID. So this is how easy it is to combine two hooks. So guys, that's all about this video. So if you have liked the video, do hit the like button. If you haven't subscribed to the channel, do subscribe to the channel. So thank you, bye bye, tata, take care and have a good day and have a great day.